as yes, you are a correspondent for Jerusalem Post, but this is not your first book. You have another book called After ISIS, America, Israel, and the Struggle in the Middle East, published almost 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago. And you've reported from all over the region, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, and the UAE, which you have expressed even more of an interest of over the last year since the Abraham Accords. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. Before we begin talking about the book, I understand you prepared a little bit of show and tell for us.
Yeah, well, I did bring a drum. So I would have actually liked to bring a few examples, but this is one of the smaller ones you can get commercially off the shelf. If you go to iDigital or something, you can find a DJI slightly larger than this. And according to the CENTCOM head, General Frank McKenzie, he thinks that commercially purchased drones, like the kind you can get at Costco, are a huge emerging threat. We know that drones are a threat anyway in the region. But the idea that you can purchase something small like this, maybe slightly larger, or you can build it from a kit, because you can buy these as a kind of kit drone, and you can then add on to them something like a grenade, or, for instance, obviously you could put drugs on them and traffic the drugs, do all sorts of things with it. So the options are limitless, I think, in terms of what we're seeing. And whether it's commercial drones, or whether it's things you build at home, or whether it's state sponsors, like Iran or America, or whatever, building huge airplanes. But I just think it's worth considering kind of the new world that we're entering in terms of all sorts of things like this and what they can mean for us, not just in terms of war, but in terms of delivering medical supplies or doing search and rescue missions. You can, let's say people are lost at sea, you can send drones up to scan the sea. Remember when there was that Malaysian airliner that went missing and ended up in some sort of who knows where? I mean, if you had 50 drones, you could be scanning all that area. When you send manned piloted aircraft up there, they have a problem. They have people in them that fall asleep. And they have fuel. Drones also have fuel, but drones can be very lightweight. They don't have people. They don't have all the payloads in them. So I think that is a lot of the applications we're going to see, is not just about warfare.
Are we going to see it fly around the room? Or?
No, because I think this. By the way, this is a Tello. This is the cheapest drone you can buy. And I think that I've flown it around with my kids in the house. And it wobbles around, and you can do all sorts of cool flips. But you can also run into things and destroy the drone, or if it hits you, it doesn't hurt you.
Okay, so I mean, other than it being very cool and something you can show the kids. I'm assuming that there's a little more to why you are looking into this topic specifically, your experiences around the region reporting. Why drones?
Well, I think after I was covering the conflict against ISIS, and ISIS was, as many of you probably recall, in 2014, a kind of genocidal terror, army, right? I mean, they were kidnapping and killing thousands of people in Iraq, carrying out terrorist attacks all over Europe. They controlled this huge swath of area. But the war against ISIS was very much a conventional war. It was fought with special forces, tanks, planes. I mean, this was a kind of war people are used to. It's a kind of war that Israel fights in many ways against, Hamas or Hezbollah, other things like that on the ground. But when I was in Mosul, in the fight against ISIS in 2017, one of the things we began seeing, I remember first seeing it on Twitter, was the Iraqi army guys were very, very afraid of what they said was ISIS drone threats. And you thought, well, that must just be a figment of his imagination, the ISIS drones. How's it possible? ISIS was making kit drones like this and buying them and changing them and putting grenades on them. And not only doing that, they were then filming their drones, dropping grenades on tanks and dropping them on people and things like that. So when we went into Mosul, a lot of the Iraqi army guys had been issued all sorts of weird gear, like these giant jammer guns where you can try to jam drones and things like that. But they didn't have nearly enough, they were basically naked. They didn't have anything really to stop this threat. And so every time there was a buzzing in the air, and that could be either an American drone or an ISIS drone or one of the Iraqi army's own drones, they didn't know. The guys were always freaked out, and it was a whole other threat level, because if you have to deal with snipers or whatever, you can get used to ducking and crawling and getting whatever you're used to doing. But when you have this weird threat up above, all of a sudden you have an Iraqi army backed up by a US-led coalition, which includes 70 countries, the most wealthy countries in the world. And there's no air defense against these stupid things. And even today, there's not enough defenses. I saw that when Joe Biden was going to Europe. If you Google around, you say like Biden, drones or whatever, you'll see all these guys carrying around these giant weird ray guns because they're trying to protect against all this stuff. Because they're very, very afraid. And drones have been used to try to carry out assassinations in Venezuela. They've been used, obviously, against Israel. They've been used all over this region. So I think that was one thing that led me to think about this topic. And then, as I was doing defense reporting all the time, every other 3 stories I was writing was about drones. For some reason, I was like, wait, I'm not writing about tanks anymore. There's no innovations there. I'm not writing much about, F-35s. I mean, there's an F-35. I mean, there are no new rifles coming out. But what was always new, what companies were always saying is, oh, we have something really cool. Come look at this. It was always on the drone front. It was either the machine itself, or usually the weird technology that's being stuck on them. So, like, for instance, better optics or artificial intelligence, which to me, I was like, well, what does that mean? What's artificial intelligence? Well, think, for instance, of a drone, scanning, for instance, for some sort of terrorist or something like that. And instead of having a human operator sit there and watch the screen all day and go to sleep and drink 1,000 cups of coffee, instead of that, you program the algorithms and all this so that the drone begins to identify patterns of behavior. So that the drone, for instance, can warn the guy who's supposed to be drinking all those cups of coffee, hey, look, we've got a truck, and every time this truck comes, it stays for 5 minutes, and it's very suspicious. All the other vehicles do something that seems normal, but this one vehicle does something that's different. Or for instance, you can identify an RPG in the back of the truck based on, for instance, maybe the drone has been trained through algorithms to differentiate between a grenade and a cup of water or whatever. So it all of a sudden tells the guy, wake up, wake up, there's an RPG in the back of that truck. Why? That's not supposed to be there. So those types of patterns and that stuff, all this stuff we're starting to see being added on. And I think that's the reason I said, well, over a drink with David Hozoni, who's sitting right there. You know what? That's a book idea. We should do something.
Well, it makes sense. Your timing obviously is excellent. We heard today about the alleged strike on an Iranian facility.
With something like this, supposedly.
Supposedly, something like that. So who in the region should we be most afraid of? Like where are the main threats? Which are the countries, which are the regimes that are using these technologies for offensives that Israel should be worried about? Should people be worried about Israel?
Well, I think what's fascinating is if we go back and look at the history of drones, we hear this word drone. What was a drone? It's just a remote control aircraft. Right? People in the 80s and 70s had remote control planes. You can buy them for your kids, right? I mean, so there were already remote controlled things that existed. And when they existed decades ago, when the military started thinking, well, that's kind of cool, maybe we could use that. They were used to do things like fly over a country and just take pictures and then come back to base or whatever, fall in the sea and be picked up. And they were also used as target practice. So instead of having an F-15 shoot an unmanned F-15 and kill your own pilots, obviously it doesn't work. So what you do is you build some sort of thing that looks kind of like an F-15 and you fly over the sea and then you shoot at it to see, for instance, you want just air defenses like Iron Dome or something, you have to shoot down things. Just a day ago, Israel used lasers to shoot down a drone. So you have target drones. They were being used a lot. And Israel was one of the pioneers of saying, wait, no, target drones are stupid. Wait, but we have something cool here. We have a vehicle. It doesn't require a person in it. And we have a problem. There's Syrian air defenses in Lebanon in 1982. And the Syrian air defenses are mobile. They're mobile SAM batteries. You've got a truck with air launching systems in the back that can shoot down planes. Well, satellite pictures don't work to deal with mobile air defense because the thing moves all the time. You need real-time intelligence. So if you can buzz a drone over the thing and take live video or pictures of it and immediately bring that back to the operators in the base, you know where the air defense is. And that's how Israel in 1982 was able to totally decimate Syria's air defense in Lebanon during the conflict. And that woke up the Americans very quickly to say, oh my God, we need this. Even though, oddly enough, the Americans already had all these things sitting in storage, but they had to rejig them to do what companies like IAI and other companies in Israel were doing and pioneering with drones. So in terms of what that means today, who should be afraid of? I think what's the crazy story is Israel and America basically invented these machines. There were things out there in the Soviet Union, things like that. But in terms of real pioneers, Israel pioneered this stuff with things that like II and companies that were building, like the Scout and all these cool drones. If you go online, you can see, you go like Israel's first drone, you can see what it looks like. Not that sexy, but it worked. The Americans built the Predators, also was partly designed by an Israeli man who moved to America. And the Predators became the kind of sine qua non of the drone world. Whenever people think of a drone, they always think of that thing that looks like a Predator. Today, I have bad news. The Americans, Israel is of course a cutting-edge country, but I think Western countries have fallen behind in terms of the drone arms race, and I think the drone world order that we're entering. And that means that countries like China and Iran and Turkey and maybe Russia are rapidly either catching up or moving into the future. And what that means is a country like Iran is not a wealthy country, and they're under sanctions. So they don't have great tanks. And you know, if you ever look at Iranian Air Force, go on Google. Iran's Air Force, by the way, half of it was built by the Americans in like the 70s. It's the same planes. But what is really interesting is they don't need an Air Force now. They're building an instant Air Force of drones. It's cheap, you can build lots of them, and you don't need to train pilots. Nobody dies. I mean, your enemies die, but your own people don't die. It's great for Iran. It's great for the type of warfare Iran wages, which is this proxy wars, where you send drones to the Houthis in Yemen, you send them to Syria, you send them to Iraq, you send them to Lebanon. And then, oh whoops, a drone came into Israel's airspace. Oh whoops, did a drone fall on your power plant? It wasn't us. We don't know what that was. I mean, it's kind of brilliant, and it really works as this kind of plausible deniability type of warfare. Now, that's the Iranian, I think, the fear that Israel has dealt with Iran. There was a drone that flew into Israel's airspace in May. It wasn't much talked about, but if you read what was public information, Netanyahu said it was an Iranian-operated drone. It was either came from Syria or Iraq. You don't say Iraq unless it probably came from Iraq. That's a problem. There was also a drone flown into Israel's airspace by the Iranians in 2018, February. And Israel went totally crazy and bombed things in Syria, and there was an F-16 that got shut down or crashed on the state. So Israel takes this very seriously. Hamas used drones in the last war, and what happened for the first time in Israel's history? Iron Dome shot one of them down, at least publicly you know about. And the other ones were destroyed by other means. Maybe F-16s, missiles, maybe other things. So we know about the Iranian drone threat. I think Israel has that pretty much in control. However, I think in terms of the world order, what matters really is the Chinese drone possibilities. China has pioneered all sorts of crazy cool drone things, not for military purposes as much as we've seen these drone light shows. If you Google like drone light shows, where they use thousands of drones to do these figures in the sky. And imagine if they took that technology of using 1,000 drones and doing a light show and put little munitions on them. And let's say you had an aircraft carrier, like a U.S. aircraft carrier, steaming around somewhere in the South Pacific or whatever it is, and 1,000 drones came flying at it. It doesn't matter how big your air defenses are. It doesn't matter how many lasers you have. You can't shoot them all down because you have a time problem. How are you going to do it? You can't do it. I mean, it's like if you're playing soccer, a goalie can be very good. You kick 1,000 balls to the guy at the same time. You can't stop it. So I think that's where we're going, and I think China is like Iran because it is willing to innovate in the sense that China knows maybe it can't build identical things to the Americans, and it's not going to build an F-35 fighter that's as good. But China's like, yeah, we don't need to do that. We'll just build 1,000 of them. Look at the F-35s, for instance. Israel only has like 50 of these things, right? Okay, so we'll build 1,000. I mean, that's the kind of big numbers, and I think China is willing to use, pioneer types like, networked information, big data, all these things we hear about, artificial intelligence, drone swarms, and I think we'll see, if there ever is a conflict in the Pacific, the possibility of things like that, along with missiles and other things, being used to decimate Western, Australian, American, or other big platform like things like aircraft carriers and things that you can't replace. An aircraft carrier gets sunk, how do you build it again? That takes like 20 years. It's finished.
Understood. I want to get a little bit into how to deal with these threats, but just before taking us, opening some brackets, you mentioned the sanctions against Iran being something that creates a situation in which they're turning to cheaper or drone technologies because it's something that's easier to do with the current sanctions. If we are to see a situation in which the sanctions are lifted, how do you think this will change things on the ground? Will the use of this technology change? Will other things, or like, what do you see that taking us?
Look, Iran has a long way to go back. Even if you get rid of the sanctions, I feel like Iran has so many problems in terms of infrastructure. It needs to repair its rail networks. It has a lot of things that it needs to work on. In terms of its military capabilities, it's done well under the sanctions, plowing money into things like drones and ballistic missiles. And there's no doubt that Iran, I think, is much more powerful today, not only regionally, but in terms of some of the missile programs. The missiles are becoming more precise. They're flying further. The fact that Iran was able to take a group like the Houthis in Yemen, who most people had never really heard of, and who were not very dangerous, and put them on steroids, turn them into a group that has missiles and drones, but missiles that are reaching Riyadh. I mean, we're talking hundreds, 800 kilometers or something. I mean, well, that's crazy. And that's the same model that happened with Hamas. Look what happened in this last war. How many rockets did they fire? 4,300 rockets. Higher rocket volume than any of the wars before. It's totally crazy what they've been able to accomplish. And yet Hamas is under blockade as well. So I think that what we'll see with Iran is, if it's outside of sanctions, it will just allow it to increase all of those things, increase the drone exports, increase the missile exports. We know that there's missiles, for instance, flowing apparently into Iraq, ballistic missile threats that could reach Israel. We know that the Iranians have entrenched in Syria. We know what they've done with Hezbollah. I mean, if there's another conflict with Hezbollah, the estimates are, 1,500 or 2,000 rockets a day. That's a lot of rockets. And I think we've never seen something like that. So, and that's where I think Iran would like to expand towards. Of course, it also has a new deal with the Chinese, towards some sort of 25-year deal. You don't know who gets the better end of that bargain because the Chinese are not firing, right? The Chinese are there to get things as well. But I just think that we'll certainly see a country that is expanding its military capabilities. I think in terms of its infrastructure, the nuclear stuff, Iran has a long way.
And the lasers Israel is developing and using, could you go a little bit more into that, or even maybe what the Americans are doing? But what are we now doing in order to counter these threats that you've talked about?
Right. So air defense has existed for a long time. I mean, obviously, people were using rifles to shoot at biplanes or whatever in the First World War. I mean, whenever there's a threat, there's going to be something to stop it. So, I mean, in Vietnam, for instance, in the war, the North Vietnamese had the surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, right? I mean, Israel confronted that problem in 1973, dealing with the Egyptians. So, what it started out was, we need to find a capability to shoot down manned aircraft. Okay, we'll find a missile that will seek it out and destroy it. And then, of course, we get to the point, what Israel, I think, pioneered, which is fascinating, was things like Iron Dome or David Sling or the Arrow program, the various types of missiles Israel has built, many of them with American support. Those defenses were designed to stop missile threats. Now, when you deal with a missile threat, like, for instance, in Gaza, like the old-style ones, the Qassams or whatever they are, the Grad missiles, those types of things, a missile threat is essentially, I shoot a missile, and it's like throwing a baseball. It goes up and comes down. It has a trajectory. So if I need an algorithm to stop that, what I need to do is I need to have a radar that detects it being launched, and then the algorithm needs to immediately decide where is it going. And then the algorithm needs to decide, do we need to shoot it down? Because you don't need to shoot down all the missiles. If missiles are inaccurate, for instance, half of them fall in open areas. Every time we have a war, we hear that. The missile fell in an open area. We didn't shoot it down. Iron Dome is only triggered to shoot down missiles that are going to hit things like this, like buildings or whatever, people, strategic infrastructure. And Iron Dome has a 90% success rate against that, which is pretty good.
Some of its function is almost obsolete given the latest conflict when they were shooting volume.
Right, that's the big problem. So,
right.
And not only volume, but what about the drones?
China,
yeah.
You
volumes are a
at
problem.
the same time. So if you're adopting the same kind of technologies, how are they supposed to deal with the same volume problem?
Well, that's probably the scary little problem, which is that if Israel's enemies, or if we just think of America versus China, whatever, the one that is able to develop not only the volume of forces, but also, I think, with drones, we're not talking about, it's a totally different technology than missiles, right? It maneuvers. Right. Drones are cool, by the way, for instance. They can fly very low. Remember, by the way, isn't it the 40th anniversary of the Osirak raid, right?
Yes,
the Iraqi thing, right? Does anyone know how high the Israelis flew during that raid?
200 meters.
200 meters, right? That's nothing. Not to be a pilot, 200 meters. If there's just a small dune, you'll be flying, right? So, and imagine drones. Drones are cool because it doesn't. You're not going to lose, a pilot in a drone attack. You can fly the drones 50 meters off the thing, and I don't think radars can usually pick that up. So you have a problem. So that's why cruise missiles are cool, because cruise missiles, when they were developed, could fly low and do all sorts of interesting things. And so stopping them is hard. And by the way, cruise missiles and drones, I don't know if evolutionary, if you think it the same type of species, but you have commonalities, because they are what they call loitering munitions or kamikaze or suicide drones. Essentially, it's basically a cruise missile, except it can fly around in circles and wait for the target to appear. So I think that's, I don't remember entirely the question, but I think that's
How to deal with them?
Well, how to deal with them? So I think you need better radar. You need better radar. You need to detect them. You can detect them also from manned aircraft that are flying around. Like F-35s can detect them if they're up here. You have better radar. For instance, Israel's new warships, the SAR-6 warships, they have really great radar on them. Lots of different defenses. The Iron Dome that was specifically built for the sea, called Sea Dome. So, first of all, you need better detection systems. And then you need better ways to kill the thing. Or jam it. You can jam them, but the problem with jamming is, these Iranian type of drones, there's no guy talking to it. There's no link. It's like a V-1 rocket in the Second World. It's just told where to go. It doesn't need a guy to be like, oh, please come back. So you can jam them, but you can also need to do the hard kill or whatever to kill them. And I think what's interesting is there's a lot of layers of that nowadays. There's an Israeli company, for instance, that makes a drone that kills a drone. They have a drone. There's one that just runs into it, but there's another one that chucks a net onto it and wraps it up. It's by that company.
It's not a drone.
It's very cool. So that drone, by the way, I think it's made by a company called Extend. Anyway, they're doing all sorts of really interesting stuff with the American Special Forces, some of which is public and I've written about. So there's all sorts of cool applications out there. The idea that you have these new drone warriors or whatever, guys in attack or special operations unit, he's carrying a canister in the back. If there's a drone threat, he shoots it out, he uses a tab and he kills it. But in terms of, I think, the big real threats, the drones that have a big warhead on them, look what happened to the Saudis in September 2019. Iran used 25 drones and cruise missiles to totally decimate or be set back, their second largest oil thing or whatever. So that's bad news. And I think anyone is sitting in Israel on that day when they woke up, we're like, oh my God, this could happen before Haifa. This is not good. So I think being able to...
Haifa is owned by China, right?
Not yet.
So I think you need to detect... Oh, by the way, you know what happened last month or 2 months ago? A drone in Iraq, flown by the Iranians or one of their proxies, hit a hangar in Erbil in the Kurdistan region. And it not only hit just a random hangar at the airport, it hit a secret CIA hangar, which apparently wasn't very secret. So, and that was reported by the Washington Post, or whatever, so it's apparently true. So, I mean, the Iranians or whoever knew that not only that the Americans were using that part of the base, because that I think was known, but yeah, well, let's attack this one. So that's what really, and by the way, the Americans have defenses against that ostensibly. They have something called C-RAM that can shoot it down. They have Patriot missiles or whatever that can shoot down drones. They didn't shoot it down. And someone said that they had been tracking it with radar. And then for whatever reason, the guys flying it were smart. They put the drone on a trajectory so it looked like it was coming in a civilian route, but for whatever reason they weren't able to detect it as it flew in. So that's not good news.
All right. Well, just before we open the floor for questions, because we are the Jerusalem Press Club and we have a lot of journalists following us, I'll ask you a professional question about the actual process of the book. You're talking a lot about technologies. You mentioned IAI, and I'm sure you've spoken to many sources. How forthcoming did you find the people with whom you spoke in order to actually get into the material itself?
Well, I think in general the people I spoke to, and I spoke to everyone from General David Petraeus to to the top companies in Israel, to drone operators, one of which is a few which are in the book, one of which is he's unnamed, but he was very, very happy to tell me his life story a bit. I mean, so I think that we have, I would say that most people were quite forthcoming because look, a lot of the companies are really proud of what they've accomplished. I think that a lot of the generals are interested in they're very interested in how these things can be used in the next conflict. So most people were when I spoke to members of the Bush administration about the hunt for bin Laden, about how they used drones and what they did afterward. I spoke to think tank people and all this stuff. I think everyone was very forthcoming. There were a few people that were off the record that said, listen, I can't use my name, but here's what I think should happen, because there were people that are critical of the Air Force, for instance, maybe not spending enough, or the Air Force in America being very slow in procurement, taking decades to develop things, and then being like, well, maybe we'll buy it, maybe not. Or, for instance, the typical thing in America, which is that the things are way too expensive. What starts off as like, $1 million project becomes a $400, $200 million a piece drone. And it's like, this is insane. So there's all sorts, I think there are people that are willing to speak off the record about those issues. And it was, I think the big trouble I had writing it was, I was new to the subject matter. I'm not a tech person. I don't understand artificial intelligence. I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about optics. I don't know anything about Westinghouse engines. I know nothing about this. I really don't know. So when I started to look at it, I was like, there's a problem here, because if I wrote a book about, and I always compare this book a bit to Robert Mackey's book called Dreadnought, which is about Britain and Germany and the building of the ships prior to the Great War. And that's a great book. But you can read that book and not be an expert on, coal-fired ships or whatever. I mean, it's more about the arms race. So I approached it from that. I want to understand this technology. I think you can write a book about the use of tanks in World War II and blitzkrieg and stuff like that, and not be an expert in all the things about how the exhaust works in a tank. It doesn't matter. So I think that you can. I think I approached it that way. I did definitely have to learn a lot about Americans, especially love acronyms. So when I started to read about, when you read about anything dealing with the American military, it's an endless number of the DARPA and the Futures Command and the blah and the ALDO and it's endless. And you're like, how many of this word salad can there be? And I realized if I don't understand it, the reader doesn't understand it. So I tried to walk the reader through it a bit, or just ignore some of the things I felt like, yeah, that's nice. That was an acronym, but it does some bureaucracy was created within the army so they could have another layer of bureaucracy. But I tried to understand. I tried to read up on which units use the things, and that's how I did it.
Great. Was there...
Anybody here with a black Nissan? Sorry about that, but you're blocking a bunch of... Oh, not here?
No.
I mean, it's a restaurant.
Somebody else is blocking it.
Or there's a
Sorry,
way.
there's a wedding going. There you go.
It didn't look like somebody who's got
Such a fucking journalist, never get bored.
Audience questions? No. Wow, okay. Let's just start from the seating room. Please go ahead.
Yes, can I ask a technical question? Sorry, technical question. Are the drones guided using radio frequencies?
Repeat the question. I think so. I mean, I guess there's lots of ways to fly them. I mean, there's radio frequency. You can also do I think there's some of them that are just a program to fly somewhere, and then, as I said, there's sometimes no data link. I mean, in the beginning when they were being built, one of the big problems the Americans had, for instance, in the wars in the Balkans, was they wanted to use them in the 90s, but there wasn't issues how do you relay the link back to CIA headquarters in Langley. So they would have some really complicated, same way of doing it, where they'd have the drone out here, and then a plane flying here, and then it would be the radio towers. It was like some endless thing. So I think that...
No, I was just thinking if they're guided by radio frequencies, if you had 1,000 drones, are they all using the same frequency?
That's what you have to ask the operator. I have no idea. I don't understand it. I don't really understand it. I'm sure it's a huge challenge. And there's all sorts of things going on out there now where you have the idea of some sort of, like a drone mothership or whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of these things.
So, could you repeat questions, please?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
David?
How can we get a copy of the book?
Questions under your Q&A. Seth will sign online to purchase coffee.
Right, they're on sale for 80 shekels when I sign them, and then obviously you can buy them on Amazon, you can buy them at ShamanSchuster.com, you can buy them at Book Depository, this.com, whatever.
Well, it's Stamatsky.
Well, that's a good question.
Why not?
Seth, what was the story, or I guess what happened to that so-called re-engineered drone that the Iranians?
Was that the Sentinel? The
Yeah,
RQ-180 or whatever?
yeah. Were they able to actually re-engineer?
That was the one that came from Kandahar in Afghanistan, right? That was the American one that got shut down, so that's stealthy. The interesting thing. They used to call it the Beast, apparently. It was like this really interesting, like, kind of triangular thing that used to fly around Afghanistan. And it was spying on Iran, apparently. And the Iranians somehow managed to hijack a signal or something and land. They said they landed it, or it crashed or something. And then a huge embarrassment for the Americans. And then a few months later, the Iranians rolled this thing out, and they were like, well, you see, we rebuilt it. So look, that thing exists. Not only does it exist in America, and there are probably better versions of it now that are more stealthy and have much better encrypted links. But the Iranians have rebuilt things like it. Now the question is the Iranian thing that stealthy? Does that thing work? How far can it fly? I mean, so I think that, the Iranians love to do this kind of, show trial type of thing, where they wheel the thing out. Like, during this Gaza war, they wheeled out a new drone called Gaza. It's nonsense. It takes a long time to develop a drone. So they love to do this thing to embarrass the Americans. And look, you can buy, if you shoot down a drone and you have pieces of it, obviously you can make a model of it, right? But I've seen what the Iranians do sometimes. You'll see these drones sometimes, they're launched in some weird way, like from the back of a truck or something, so you know that the thing doesn't land. I mean, if it's launched in some weird way, I mean, those drones maybe are kamikaze drones or whatever, but you'll never get them back. So there's all sorts of weird things the Iranians do, and it is a question of how well does it work. But we know that some of it works, because the Houthis have used these drones to great effect against the Saudis. They don't kill thousands of people, they don't win wars with them, but they can harass you. So I think we'll see. Another problem with that is, I'm sure that what the Iranians shut down ended up in the hands of the Russians and the Chinese, and they're probably much better at reverse engineering things like that.
Leah, it's been very interesting.
One teeny anecdote and a question. About 2.5 years ago, I was visiting England, and jointly with that same time, the airports were closed because of a drone threat.
Right.
And it was people, it was just apparently an innocent couple playing with their drone, but they happened to close a major airport.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to see more of that.
And by the way, they have Israeli technology there. Israel makes all sorts of these cool gadgets like Drone Guard and Drone Dome and Redrone.
But my question is, obviously we're going to see more and more commercial use of drones, and we should do with like delivery of everything from pieces to medicines, as you said, and surveillance and drugs.
Medical marijuana will be done by drone.
So how are we going to differentiate between the commercial drone? I mean, obviously, if it's got a till now on it, you can tell the difference, but there'll be a way of disguising it. How eventually are you going to be able to tell what's a commercial drone and what's actual a real threat?
When they put it in Baghdad, the Amazon delivery.
Yeah. I think what we're going to see, and I've seen this a bit in Israel or at least talk discussions about trying to build things like this, drones that can fly in civilian, segregated or non-segregated airspace. So, by the way, the reason you don't see things like Predators and Herons and all these drones that exist flying around in the sky is because they're banned. You're not allowed to fly drones, even though you're not really supposed to fly military drones over civilian airspace. I mean, so we haven't gotten to the point yet where drones are being used for riot control and all sorts of things inside, in Israel, be inside the Green Line, and in America, it would obviously be inside America, but we're not seeing them being used the way they were used, and to much criticism in Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, all these ungoverned spaces. Basically, military drones these days are used in ungoverned spaces, or they're used off the coast. Why was the American Global Hawk shut down by Iran, this huge thing that cost billions of dollars, or hundreds of millions? Because it was flying off the coast of Iran, and the Iranians waited for it and shut it down. So I think that what we'll see in the future in civilian airspace is they have to pass laws for this, to have, think of airspace like a sandwich, and they'll have a layer that is a drone layer, And it will be used by certain registered companies or whatever, and they can use that for certain things. There's been some practice attempts at that in Israel to see, can you create a drone corridor or whatever. I mean, so we'll see when that happens. We already have civilian drones are allowed in most countries. I mean, obviously not in every country, like in Iran, they'll put you in prison, but civilian drones like this, or you're allowed to have them, they're legal. But there's like, fencing or whatever, geofencing or whatever, areas you can't fly them, obviously, or they just won't work. You'll fly them next to an airport or a cedar installation, will fly to the sky. And there usually are limits, how high they can fly. So things like that. So, if you buy a DJI drone in this country, you can buy them for like $1,000 or something. It's really, really cheap, right? If you buy the new one that has the FPV or the first-person view thing, it's really cool. But you can spend about $2,000 or whatever, but then you can fly that around, it's really cool. But there are certain areas you can't fly it. So I think we'll just see a lot more of that fencing, and when you go to national parks, you're not supposed to use them. There's all sorts of places you can use them. So that's what we'll see. But in terms of using them for civilian stuff, like putting out forest fires, why not? Or search and rescue at sea, civilian applications, or delivering medical supplies. Or what about delivering like kidneys or live hearts or things that have to be moved quickly. You can do that. Surveillance, of course. We're already afraid, though, of the police state, right? I mean, so the problem with surveillance is now you'll have all that instead of just CCTV. So we'll see what happens. By the way, drones can be used to monitor traffic, make sure you don't go too fast. So I'm not sure we want them doing that. So
You've waited for a while.
Yeah, so a similar sort of question. So you started off talking about ISIS and how they were using them, and then we sort of segued into the national threats. Iran's got them, China's got them. But technically, couldn't someone like, I don't know, the Proud Boys or Black Lives Matter get hold of these things and turn them into could we see a levelling off of conflict insofar that civilians would be able to match?
The problem with civilian criminals is they haven't even thought about how to use this technology. Most criminals are not as smart as you think they are, but they should be. Because if I was a bank robber, if I was a drug dealer, I would use them.
We're live.
He said if.
It's a no-brainer. I don't know. I assume it's happening anyway. But drones are ideal. Drones are ideal for criminal networks to deliver drugs, to do all sorts of weird scamming. By the way, you could use drones to harass police during a riot. It's no doubt that it's already happening. That it will happen in the future. Criminal networks will get more of them, and that's why Homeland Security and all these organizations, the FBI, et cetera, are going big into getting things to stop them. And I talked about the idea of the drone with the nets that can fall on other drones. These people, you're going to see all this law enforcement buying a lot of this stuff. And I think that because these threats will increase, and I think we will see innovative use of them, and I think we will see more domestic terror, not necessarily in Israel, but I think in places like America. That's only a matter of time.
Used for investigative journalism. Fly over secluded building and the pool and see what's going on there.
Well, paparazzi, how come I'm assuming I'm sure paparazzi are using them. I mean, so obviously, that's another application. You can fly the drone over Kim Kardashian's house or whatever. So rich people like that have the resources now to buy drone things that can do the jammer probably. So you'll see competition in every walk of life, I think, to deal with this type of issue.
Got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions because we want to give Seth some time to sign books. So, Paul, right?
Yeah. To what extent do you think that Israel's concern about Iran's development with the drones and advancement with drones plays into Israel's position on the nuclear deal and the fact that the nuclear deal focuses only on the nuclear deal, doesn't address other issues that are around Iran's military capabilities?
I don't know. I've never heard. I'd love to, so I wrote a book about it. But I've never actually heard Israelis complaining too much about the drone threat being a real problem. They complain about the ballistic missile threat. You know why the ballistic missile threat is a big problem? Because the ballistic missile threat, when it gets big enough, you can put a nuclear warhead on it, like an ICBM. And that's what Israel doesn't want. So that's why Israel doesn't want them having a capability to deliver a nuclear weapon. And Israel can shoot down all sorts of things, but the idea of that would be very, very problematic. So I think that's why we haven't heard drones with nuclear weapons yet. So I think that's why we're not hearing about that being said. People are saying, we need to regulate the Iranian drone industry. But I would think if the Iranians start doing more and more bad things with these machines, I think that we will start to hear more about that being the problem. And I would say, if someone covers it, I think people should be writing about it more. I write about it, so I think it's...
There are two in the back that...
Thank you. My name is Amir. I'm a lecturer at the Armenian Theological Seminary, so you can kind of anticipate where those questions are going to go. We had the war on the Caucasus not that long ago. And first of all, you address this in the book, and basically the question is, how instrumental were our drones and Turkey's drones in Azerbaijan during the war? Were they what won the war, or were they like a factor among other, this coronavirus or other things that were going on?
Well, I do discuss that in the book. I use the Armenian conflict as one example. It's not a huge amount of pages, but it is mentioned as an example of a modern drone frontier warfare, like Libya and places where you're seeing more drones. And I think that when we look at that conflict, one of the things that's important to understand, I think, about it is that the Azeris invested a huge amount of money in drones. And this goes back not just to the Turkish drones, but was publicly known about the Israeli drones that were exported there. And there's no shortage of those drones that have been exported there, and some of that is public information. So I think that Azerbaijan's a smart country in that respect. They decided to pour massive resources into not buying things like F-35s, because they're not going to get any way from the Americans, but to buy drones and have an instant air force. And I think they planned very carefully for this conflict with Armenia. I think that they were, of course, pushed by the Turks into that conflict, but I think that if you look at what they did using the drones, they were very, very interesting. They used like smaller planes, like Cessnas and things, and other planes that they'd even turned into kind of drones to decoy air defenses. And once the air defenses turned on their radars, it shot down this crappy plane. Then would come in the drones, whether it's the Israeli-style Harrods or other things like that. Some of that is public information. It's been written about by some of the Israel's journalists, so you can go online and see some of that. And the Turkish drones as well were obviously used. The Turks have this Bayraktar drone, which is kind of like a small version of a Predator. It has a few missiles on it. I would think it was, I don't know if it was decisive in winning the war. I think it was pretty decisive, because it seems to me that the drones were used to knock out air defenses and take out things like armor and artillery, and it left the Armenian fighters, really at a setback and a disadvantage. Because I think Armenians could have stopped the Azeris man-to-man in terms of military vehicles and armored vehicles and artillery. I don't think they would have had as big a problem, but they lacked air support and stuff. So that seems to have been a huge problem for them.
Back.
Hi, I'm Mara Gilad. I'm a freelance journalist. I've heard a lot of talk about technology, but I'm wondering about the human factor. In that, the reason why there is this technology and the problem with the Iranians, the problem with Gaza, is that these people just they live in a nest of hate, and I'm wondering if you discuss that in the book, where you have these summer camps. And you have these kids being taught to hate. And just the ideology of the Iranians is just this ideology of hatred of anyone who's the other. And I'm wondering if you discussed that at all in the book.
It's more of something I would have discussed, I guess, in my previous book, After ISIS. I think this book was more about the kind of drone arms race and the technology, and also the kind of interesting story of the people that invented this stuff. In my view, I think the Iranians that are drone pioneers over there that invented this stuff, these are fascinating individuals. So I'd say that it's more about that and about where we're going to go in terms of this. It doesn't look that much at ideology. It does talk about drones being used in counterterrorism. It talks about the ethics of drone warfare. Is it wrong, for instance, to use these machines to track people, or whether they kill civilians or whatever? There's no one to answer for that. There's no operator you can get the name of or whatever. I talk about that, but I think that that's not really what you're asking. So I think that, no, I would say mostly it doesn't touch on it.
Okay, last question from Dr. Spire, and then we'll get to the book signing.
As a doctor myself. Seth, you mentioned that you're not aware of Israeli
planners and strategists talking about the specificity of the Iranian drone threat. And you did mention in passing the attack in September 2019 on Kite and Quraysh, in which, you know, everyone here knows, but essentially the Houthis, i.e. the Iranians, overwhelmed Saudi air defenses and succeeded in cutting for 24 hours global oil production by 5%. Incredibly successful use of drones. So it would seem, you know, everybody I think here at that point asked, well, what would happen if we were to suffer something like that? From your conversation with Israeli planners and strategists, do you have a sense that Israel does have a response to that, or is that something which we should be very concerned about?
When that happened, I immediately wrote a piece about it. I interviewed some people from Rafael and other places, and many of whom had been in the defense sector prior to that. And I think one of them used the term Pearl Harbor to describe that case. And I think that was very much the big wake-up call that they were worried about. And I think that if you look in the fall of 2020, so last year, there was discussions or mentions of how Iron Dome and integrated air defense in Israel had new capabilities. And all those new capabilities, I think, when it came out during the Hamas war that Iron Dome had shot down drones and things, I think we understood that these new capabilities were to jam-pack all of this integrated air defense with stuff to stop an Abqaiq-style attack. So I think certainly it definitely woke people up in Israel. I think this is a very big problem. Also, the fact that Newsweek reported in January of this year that the Houthis had a drone that had been sent from Iran or reconstructed that could reach Israel. And there were then rumors or reports in Israel that air defenses had been increased near Eilat to stop things like that. So I think we have to, I think Israel takes it very seriously. I think the issue is whether they saw it, like, I think there was a question about whether Israel looks at it like the ballistic missiles and nuclear program. I just think that that's not something I've ever heard, is that Israel wants drones to be addressed by the Americans in discussions with Iran. I think Israel sees the drones as a big problem. And certainly drones can be used against strategic infrastructure in Israel. I think there's probably a degree to which some of it's not fully discussed, because the idea is, well, wait, we don't want to give the Iranians any ideas of what to do. So let's just see what the Iranians are doing. And I think that's certainly on the radar. And I think definitely there's the book. I think we're going to see a lot more of this, because we're seeing it every day anyway, in terms of the attacks in Iraq and this story about a drone being used in Iran. I mean, it's almost like I pay them to do PR. Okay,
I think we're good to go, because we want to leave some time for... I'll also thank our team here who put together the event, our fabulous interns, Untitled Chapter. Thank you.
Right, so I'm happy to sign some books. I can, they're 80 shekels, I have some change. So I can do that.
We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.